Welcome to the Vantage Performance Podcast. I'm Phil Dobbie, and today we look at navigating the growth curve. How can you ensure that your business continues to prosper as demand increases? How do you scale up, in other words? Michael Fingland is Executive Director and CEO of turnaround specialist Vantage Performance. He says the most dangerous and hardest period in the growth of a small to medium business is the period when its turnover pushes beyond $15 million. Now, Michael, I'm surprised it's actually not earlier than that before businesses start to struggle with this idea of scale.
Most successful entrepreneurs can get to $15 million pretty much on their own. You know, they've built a good business, but it's heavily reliant upon them and their brand and their goodwill and their ability to inspire their team, if you like. The reason why most businesses get into strife when they're going from 15 through to 50 is they're having to upgrade pretty much everything in the business. And most businesses that are transitioning from that 15 to 50 mil mark are usually doing it at a fair rate of knots. And because they haven't done it before, they don't know the pitfalls that lay ahead.
So it is scaling up then, isn't it, really? And isn't a big part of that, therefore, making the capital investment so you can operate efficiently from that point onwards?
Yeah, it's capital is certainly part of it, but when you're going through that transition, every part of the business needs to be overhauled, for want of a better word. You've typically outgrown the skill set of a lot of the managers you've got in the business, so they either need to be retrained or they need to develop new skills, new management skills to cope with the demands of a much bigger business. Their capital structure, usually if you've had a fairly simplistic overdraft or equipment finance type lending structure, very simple, you need to put in place a more sophisticated and flexible funding structure, and whether it's debt or equity, to assist with that growth. Because a lot of businesses, and ironically, roughly 1/3 of our clients over the last 15 years that get into strife are still growing at 30 or 40% year on year, and they outgrow their systems, they outgrow their finance structures, and that could be profitable. And that's the irony here, is you can be growing 30, 40, 50% year on year and be profitable, but still run out of cash.
Yeah, and I guess also, do you also run out of time? Because, I mean, if you're too busy coping with the growth that you've got, you haven't actually got the time to put all these new systems and structures and processes into place.
That's right, and that's the typical entrepreneurial CEO is always incredibly time poor, and their excuse is, I don't have time to look at that, or I don't have time to bring in expertise, or let's deal with that in 3 or 4 months' time, because they can't see how that workload is going to dissipate. So they hope that things will get better in the future. Then you'll bring someone in, or hire some different people. But when you're in that position, it's a minority of entrepreneurs who actually identify that and are aware enough and self-aware enough to know they need help now, not in 3 months, not in 6 months. Because as I said, a lot of clients can go bust when they're still growing at 30, 50% year on year.
Right. If you're the head of the business, if you're the entrepreneur that got it all started, though, and you're failing to recognize that, isn't that a sign that you're actually not the right person to be running the business at that stage? No,
not necessarily. Often what it needs, and this is why we've become huge advocates of coaches and advisory boards over the years, because a coach, an executive coach, and we're not talking a business coach here, we're talking one-on-one, very senior, qualified, 30, 40 years in the business executive coach who's been through it and has seen all the pitfalls, and advisory boards for the more sophisticated businesses, because a business running that fast, no matter how good a CEO you are, you cannot see all the pitfalls ahead. You just can't. So you need someone objective who's off to the side, whether they're an executive coach or you've got an advisory board in place, who can identify those issues and raise it to the level of concern that it needs to be raised to. So the CEO then can put appropriate resources and time and energy into fixing those areas of the business.
Right. But that executive coach or that advisory board, I mean, they're going to be hard to find, aren't they, the people to fill those roles, because they have to have been through this exact situation. Someone who's actually been in a large corporation that's already been through this perhaps aren't going to be able to offer as much advice. You need someone who has been there and experienced it.
Oh, look, you do and you don't. I mean, the common mistake that a lot of entrepreneurial CEOs or family businesses make is, to enable me to step back and spend more time strategizing and helping the business grow consistently. They get a GM in. They think a general manager is going to be the panacea, so they get a general manager in, and 12 months later, it's all ended in tears. The number of times we've come across clients that have tried that, it didn't work. Often what's more successful is to bring in that coach or bring in an advisory board first. They can help you then lay out the landscape of all the pitfalls that you're going to be coming across over the next 3 to 5 years as you navigate through that $50 million mark. Because once you've built all the systems, because one thing we haven't touched on is systems and supply chain and working capital management. All those areas are overhauled through that process. And typically, once you've got to $50 million and you've built all those systems, you've got really good, management reporting system, you've got great supply chain management, you've got more sophisticated survey tools to know how your customers and staff are doing on a regular basis. That infrastructure you've built, that will then carry you to 100 million and often 150 million. So that just gives you some context as to how much building is actually having to take place during that $20 to $50 million mark, particularly, because it does set you up for another $100 million worth of growth. So it is a lot of work that needs to be done, and you can't cut corners. And this is where you build those really, really strong foundations.
Right, because the general manager may well do exactly what you've been doing, which is coping with the growth rather than coping with the long term. But what you're talking about is putting the rigor in place, isn't it? So very often a company will have got to that 15 million stage by bolting stuff together, sort of like let's make do, just long as we're getting the sales and it's all working.
That's right, chasing growth for growth's sake.
Yeah, whereas now you're talking about systems and processes that are going to enable you to grow as a big business. And again, I get back to that point I made earlier. Does that mean that it seems like an entirely different mindset? And can you actually train managers who are not used to that to be able to cope with that?
Yeah, you can. Most management teams can survive the journey, if you like. They'll need some additional training. And a simple analogy is, as you're growing through that process, you might have got to $15 million on the back of one key product or a few products, but once you're sort of expanding geographically and all the rest, you're adding on multiple new service lines or product lines. And as an example, that's where having a more sophisticated reporting system and accounting system where you know with certainty what the gross margin is for all those products, so you can keep a track of how they're performing. A lot of first-time entrepreneurs, whatever, just simply don't know what they don't know. So they don't know. All of a sudden, they get to a $25 million business and they're still running a simple profit and loss where they don't know. They know they made money or they didn't for the month, but they don't know where or how or why. Laying out ahead of them a strategic plan by someone who's done it before multiple times, they can then adequately put resources in place so as they are growing through that process, they're laying those foundations ahead of them. So they can still grow quickly, and it's not a discussion about slowing growth. You can still grow as quickly as you want as long as you're laying those foundations ahead of you. And most management teams going through that process haven't done it before. So that's where the advisory board, executive coach, having 13-week cash flows, 3-way forecasts, regular surveys, all the tools that we've talked about over the years in these podcasts. You've got to have those systems and tools in place to give you those warning signals where things are starting to go off the rails. And so you've then got time to address them, appropriately resource them, fix those problems. Or if certain management teams or supervisors or people in the business aren't going to cut it, then you need to also be aware of that and have plans in place to replace them with more suitable, skilled managers who can take the business to the next level. But when you're running at such a pace, like any athlete or and that's why a coach or an advisory board is so critical, is when you're running that fast, no matter how good you are, you just simply cannot see all the pitfalls ahead, particularly if you've never been through that growth phase before. So they act as the insurance policy, your sounding board, to make sure that the many, many hurdles, and there are many as you're going through that period particularly, can be navigated. And the reason why a lot of CEOs get complacent in a way is because they have got to 5 or 10, like you said before, which is the biggest danger period, because as we know, 60% of all businesses fail in the first 5 years. So they think, okay, I've got through that 5-year period. Great, it's plain sailing from here. But it's not. There's another big hurdle coming, and that's why 80% of all businesses have failed by the 10-year mark.
Yeah, that's a scary statistic, isn't it? So how do you know? Because I'm sure the point at which you need to start to make a move on all of this changes from industry to industry. We mentioned the $15 million turnover mark, but it'll be different from company to company. So how do you know when to start looking at an advisory board? Are there any warning signs that you should be looking out for?
Yeah, there are. I mean, when you start to see the culture in the business starting to throw off some signs and just starting to deteriorate. Customer complaints start to rise because you're running so hard to try and get product at the door. You're cutting corners just to try and keep up with the sales. So having a really good customer survey tool, we recommend the Net Promoter Score or NPS tool, which we've talked about on this show before. That gives you really quick, honest feedback as to how things are going. But they're the two, if staff aren't happy and they're really struggling to keep up and you're starting to have staff turnover, key warning sign. Customer turnover, key warning sign. Customer returns, those sorts of things. When you see your working capital, so your cash, debtors, stock and creditors, and there's a formula, debtors cash less and stock less creditors, that's your working capital. That's how much cash you've got tied up in the business. If that is growing at a faster pace than your sales, then you know you're heading for a brick wall. So having a simple formula in your monthly dashboard, which is why we always have this in here, is showing the rate of working capital versus the rate of revenue growth. And quite often, a lot of those businesses that are growing 30, 50% year on year, that's what's getting out of whack. Their working capital is growing, so they're building up too much stock. They're not collecting in their debtors as quickly as they used to. Revenue's still going great, and that's what they're focusing on, and they're profitable. But all that cash is being tied up in the business, and it's getting bigger and bigger and bigger disproportionately to revenue growth. That means your cash flow coming out of the business is deteriorating, even though sales are going up. That's the biggest warning sign of all. That'll usually show up before the customer and employee survey concerns that are throwing off.
Right, but I am sure that there will be business owners who will say, well, look, we've looked at the P&L, we make a good margin on our products, it's profitable. What you're talking about is introducing things that are going to add cost. You're going to squeeze our margins more. Why would we want to do that?
Well, get them to look at their cash flow. Profit doesn't always equate to cash flow. And that's where most management teams who haven't gone through that period before don't understand the difference, and there's a huge difference. So, and we're talking about, an executive coach, $2,000 or $3,000 a month. It's not a huge cost when you're thinking about how much money do you waste having to bring in a firm like us or another firm in a year's time where you're experiencing significant growing pains. I mean, the cost of replacing a senior person in the team is about 15 times. When you think about the lost productivity, the lost time, lost training, and the cost of replacement. So you think about the cost of $3,000 a month, $36,000 a year to $40,000 a year for someone to be that sounding board for you, versus several hundred thousands of dollars if you lose one or two or three key people who just get churned up by the disruption and the pace of growth in the business. It's an investment, it's not a cost.
Yeah, absolutely. It makes perfect sense. And here you are, Michael Fingland, talking yourself out of business again, trying to get people out of trouble before they need you. I don't know why you do it, but I'm glad you do. Thanks for your time.
Cheers, Phil.
Very insightful. As always, Michael Fingland on the Vantage Performance Podcast. Next time, what are the beliefs in your company? Do you need to know? That's next time. Thanks for listening.